Welcome, Ben. Appreciate the opportunity to get together with you and have this conversation. I just wanted to start a little bit by giving context to why we're getting together today. On October 10th, we got together with a group of people at Wheaton College. Around 40 people gathered for a discussion on what's happening in the Middle East. And the time and flow of that discussion, as you know, did not allow the participants to hear and answer to every one of their questions. And so I thought it'd be great if we could just get together and record a follow-up, answer some of those questions that weren't answered, and appreciate you being with me to do that.
Absolutely. Me too. Yeah, it was, and I want to say I really enjoyed that conversation. I was pleased to have a chance to talk with faculty, staff, students, and yourself from Wheaton College. Smart group of people, and I enjoyed the conversation, but looking forward to this one too.
Great. And part of what we did that evening was we had some questions for people in the room to get a sense of who was there. And I wanted to start by going through some of those responses to give us a better sense of who the audience was at that event and who I imagine some of the audience will be that watch this follow-up discussion. So we found out that about half of the room expressed to have at least some knowledge of key events and people in terms of who's involved in the events in the region. But we also had half who said they had very little knowledge of key events and people. We asked why people were there, and a little more than a third of the participants said they were interested in political questions. A little less than a third were interested in personal questions, and the rest were interested in religious questions. And very interestingly, about half of the attendees said that if they were to be characterized, they would be characterized as having a pro-Israel bias. And the other half said that they would be characterized with a pro-Palestinian bias. So I found that really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And reasons given again for why people were there were largely split between political interest and theological interest, with a number of people saying that either they have a friend from the region or they've lived in the region themselves. And unsurprisingly, the majority of people present indicated a pessimism about where things are headed. So one of the things I want to do in this conversation, it felt like most of what we landed on in our conversation on October 10th centered around religious questions. But when we looked at the submitted questions after the event, we saw more of them were of a political or personal nature. So we really want to address those, and most of these are going to end up, I think, being more political questions. But hopefully we can do that. So if you could start, I think it'd be great for people to know who you are, why you're a part of this conversation, and then I'll talk a little bit about myself before we jump in.
Sure thing. Yep, my name is Ben Norquist. I'm the director of the Network of Evangelicals for the Middle East, which is a network of pastors and lay Christians and everyday Christians and authors and whatnot, evangelicals, Jesus people, who are wanting to think more carefully about the Israel-Palestine conflict and about the broader Middle East, and even about American Christian relationships to violence in general and to peacemaking, far more carefully about those topics than their churches, their pastors, their communities have typically treated those topics. So they're hungry for the kinds of conversations that we had last week and that we're about to have. What else to say? I used to work at Wheaton College, so getting the invitation to come and bring, but it was kind of doing other kind of work at Wheaton. So being able to come back and now talk at Wheaton about Israel, Palestine, it meant a lot to me. So I guess I'll pause there.
All right, thanks. And a little context of who I am, why I wanted to have this conversation is I taught at the American University of Beirut, and I lived in Lebanon, in Beirut, for 17 years. My wife is Lebanese, so I have a very personal connection, was part of a Lebanese family during my time in Beirut. But also, my undergrad was in theology at Wheaton College. I have an MA in religion from Trinity International University. My wife and I moved over to Beirut to live intentionally in Muslim community. And that led me to a deeper study of the region, a deeper study of history, of religion, of politics. So I ended up with a MA in Middle Eastern Studies, learned how to speak Arabic fluently during my time, lived mostly in Lebanon, but also had an opportunity to live in Damascus, Syria for a while. And so all of those things kind of were swirling together. My wife and I moved to Wheaton in 2019, but have been very connected with Lebanon since we came to the US. And I currently work in the MA and TESOL program at Wheaton College. And when these events, the events have been going on for quite some time, but as it began to flare up in Lebanon, really struck me as something different happening than had happened in all my years in the region. And I just felt a real need to have a conversation.
Yeah.
So I was really grateful, talked to my department about it, and they sponsored the conversation, and that's sort of what's led us here. So
That's great. Yeah, this year, I mean, you made the point that it feels different. It feels different to me too, and not just what's happening in the Middle East, but the kinds of conversations that Americans are having and American Christians are having. There are some ways in which they're more of the same, but I'm finding that emerging out of those conversations, there is a new minority hunger, among a minority of American Christians. Evangelicals is who I work with, for a different kind of conversation about it. And that aspect, there's so much about this that's discouraging, but that aspect of it has actually been an encouragement to me this year.
Oh, that's good to hear. All right, let's go ahead and jump into some of the questions that were submitted. So I'm going to read the question, and this first question is more political. But the question was, could you comment on the stance of the U.S. and its involvement in the Israel-Hamas conflict? Is the U.S. really fulfilling a quote-unquote duty to pursue peace? And if not, how should Christians react to that?
Great question. I am reading in this question a reference to a concept that I talked about in the live event. I think that's what I'm seeing. That quote unquote duty to pursue peace, I believe, is back to when someone asked us the question, does Israel have a right to defend itself? And in the course of responding to that and kind of expanding on what, like, the idea of nations having rights, and to the degree that there's a right to defense, that there's also a duty to pursue peace. And that was something that we contributed to the conversation there. And I would say, in response to this question, which is about the U.S. Disposition towards the Israel-Hamas conflict, is it pursuing a duty to pursue peace? I would say no, or not well. And you could think about this in response to a lot of different ways, but I think that the U.S. Policy towards this war has demonstrated more of a commitment to supporting their ally Israel in its priorities, whatever they happen to be, than in pursuing a sustainable peace. Now, there have been, U.S. efforts to help facilitate peace negotiations, ceasefire negotiations, hostage release negotiations, and all of that. So it's not that there's been no activity, but when push comes to shove, it seems to be that the U.S. will defer to what Israel wants. There have been moments where maybe the U.S. could have drawn a red line. It's called, some kind of like non-negotiable, principled criteria, after which, if Israel went further beyond the red line, that the U.S. would start exacting penalties. But those red lines have all turned out to just be rhetoric. I remember months ago when it looked like Israel was going to go into Rafah, for example, and it was going to create a huge, a massively escalated humanitarian situation. There was a red line kind of statement made, and then Israel went into Rafah, and the U.S. has not held them accountable for that. U.S. regularly vetoes UN resolutions that seek to sanction Israel for certain activities. It has vetoed 3 UN resolutions that have called for humanitarian ceasefires. So these are actions, I would say, of a country that is not, whose priority is not peace, sustainable peace. And else, I do want to make a distinction between peace as just kind of a temporary ending of the conflict, and a long-term peace that will require much more sophisticated and structural changes to the situation.
Yeah, and that's
else?
the second part of this question. I think is so. There's 2 parts to it, right? First is, what is the U.S.'s role as a nation state, and what is self-interest, what is pursuing peace, what is looking out for your allies, things like that. But the second question, and I'm assuming the person asking is, as a U.S. citizen, how should Christians respond to the U.S. posture?
Yep.
So that is a different type of question.
Yep. Yeah, and some of these answers will be familiar to anyone who's asked this question before, but I would start by saying pray, and pray on your own. Find others to pray with, and I would say be politically and civically active. Make sure that your elected officials know where you stand on this issue, and before you say that doesn't make a difference, I will say it does make a difference. It doesn't necessarily make the difference that you want in the time frame that you want, but so few people engage with, regular citizens engage with their elected officials, that your voice gets counted and it matters. And so, it's maybe a little intimidating to call your elected officials' offices for the very first time. But once you've done it once or twice, it kind of becomes, it's not intimidating. You just call, you tell them where you stand, what you want them to know about you, make sure that they know that you're a constituent, and make your voice heard.
Great.
I guess I'll also say, find ways to, and this can be challenging sometimes, but so valuable when it succeeds, to prompt constructive conversations about these topics, within your church community. It could be with friends or in a small group setting, or take your pastor out to coffee, and in non-threatening kinds of ways, bring these conversations up so that they're harder to be silent on.
I appreciate that perspective. I know living in Lebanon for me was quite an experience, and in some sense dislocated me from the U.S. context and changed my perspective of nation states in general. So I think the response in a democracy, in a civil society, is an important an important thing to consider. So thanks.
Yeah, that we have that right to do that.
Yeah. Why don't we go ahead and jump to the next question?
Yeah, this one's for you, Bill.
Okay.
So this second question is, Muslim background believers in neighboring countries with whom I have regular contact tend to distrust Islamic groups and Muslim states and their ideologies. Does this fit with what you know of MBB's attitudes today?
So I appreciate this question, and I'm going to answer it with a little bit of a caveat. I would say that my experience with believers from Muslim backgrounds would probably align with that assessment, but here's the caveat. Islam is very diverse in its forms and expressions, with more religiously and politically conservative expressions of Islam and more politically broad and more open expressions of Islam. For instance, there are Muslims in the West who are calling for a sort of reformation in Islam, similar to what occurred in European Christianity at the end of the 30 Years' War, where the Peace of Westphalia laid the groundwork for the separation of church and state. And so there are Muslims that are pushing for a similar path in Islam. So I imagine that the people that are being referenced in this question are really talking about conservative expressions of Islam that, if they're in power, might hinder their ability to follow Jesus. But I think there's a deeper question here. And I imagine, again, that the deeper question is it possible to have freedom of belief and expression under Muslim rule? And here, this type of question, I think history is such an important lens. I give the example sometimes, if you've ever seen one of those things where there's all the dots and you have to kind of stand back and look, and then a picture emerges that you can't see when
they're
you're
called magic eye pictures, or
right.
the scientific technical term for it is stereograms.
Yes.
I was just reading about this, actually. So
yeah. So I think that sometimes when we're in our own time and our own history, it's like being really close to stereogram. And then what history can do is it's stepping back, and you can see a different picture when you let history inform your sight. And so I give that as a kind of a precursor to my response, because when you look at Islam historically and the different expressions of Muslim rule, you definitely can find examples where there have been times for freedom of religious expression under Muslim. So if the question is it possible for this to happen, the historical answer is clearly yes, this has happened in the past. And so I think even a bigger question than that is related to the different ways Islam and expressions of Islam have reacted to the loss of its political influence on the world stage since the end of World War I. And Albert Harani has an excellent book. It's called Arabic Thought in the Liberal Age. And it traces this movement from a more open view towards the West to a distrust of the West as a result of world events from 1798 to 1939. So I think that bigger question of the expressions of Islam that we're most familiar with today, what are the origins of those? How do they play themselves out? Is a more interesting question. We can definitely say historically there's opportunities for freedom of expression in Islam, but how does that actually fit with the expressions that are currently in the political sphere is a different question. So that's all to say. I would say yes to the question simply, but it's not because Islam in itself necessarily prohibits freedom of expression, freedom of religious expression, or even freedom of religious choice.
There are larger historical factors at play, tectonic shifts that don't have to do with the essence of Islam.
Right.
that result in some of what we see. I wonder too. It seems like the additional layer to this is just uh, perception, and mythology, stereotypes that
Hmm.
we're reading Muslim world contexts through in the West,
Hmm.
that make it harder to see um, aspects, places that are more liberal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always, feel people ask me all the time, well, because I do a seminar on Islam and I've studied Islam. So what does Islam say about? And my response is always, which version of Islam are we talking about? Because it's a tapestry of thought and ideas and history and culture. Um, when I lived in Beirut, people used to always tell me, well, what do Americans think about? As if I could represent all the voices in America because I
Mhm.
was the American they knew, right? And I think that's just the tendency that we fall into, is to try to find the simple answer
Yeah,
to often very complicated questions.
yeah. We tend to speak in generalizations, abstractions, and try to essentialize a whole complicated phenomenon into a simple essence.
Yeah. So that runs in, that kind of takes us into the next question, which is, what are your political and theological perspectives on the conflict? So that was asked, and I'd love to hear your
Okay.
perspective, and then I can give my perspective as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, and just recognizing this is a personal question. So this is less, it's certainly kind of relevant to the question of the event, what's happening in the Middle East right now, but it's maybe just a little bit at a little bit of a remove from that. So speaking personally, I always start with Jesus in answering this question about the theological approach. Um, Jesus transforms everything for me, including the covenants, and the land promises in the Old Testament and all of that. Um, they um, they are universalized in Jesus, and as you see in the Old Testament, a a people and a land that God brings together over the course of you know um, the first five books of the Bible, and the story of a people in a land in the Old Testament, and then Jesus comes and the story gets bigger. The one story, it's not that this one story ends and a new story begins. It's that the story expands to encompass the whole world. And so now in Jesus, um, you know, the whole world is invited to into life with God, and the promised land, expands to encompass all of creation. Um, Theologically, I think some of that's happening over the course of, starts in the Gospels and continues in Paul. Um, so I'd say that's a personal kind of starting point for how I think about this. It has implications for Christian Zionist claims
Mhm.
about the modern state of Israel and that territory. Um, and then, so what are we left with if what's happening in the Middle East isn't framed for me in terms of the land promises of the Old Testament being played out, or um, or end times prophetic scenarios being played out. It's not really about that for me. It's about people and land, and kind of back to some of what you were talking about earlier, world historic events that have put people into different people groups in that region into a really difficult situation that we see playing out. in all different sorts of ways in the headlines. Um, so going back to Jesus, I hear his voice, the voice of the Samaritan. Um, that's that is that call from Jesus to be a people that cares for the suffering, the oppressed, the hurt, the mourning, to join in those experiences. Um, that is the theological and ethical imperative that I see myself being bound by. That is relevant to this, to these topics, to what's going on in the Middle East and all that. So the question that I'm asking myself is, um, am I passing Israelis and Palestinians by on the side of the road, or am I allowing myself to be implicated in what Jesus means when he's talking about be the Samaritan?
Mhm. Yeah, I think my perspective on this maybe is a little different in that because I've had this conversation with a good friend of mine multiple times. And when I was at Trinity, I took a doctoral class on continuity and discontinuity between the testaments, trying to get beyond just more of a like covenant theology versus dispensational theology position. And I definitely have theological perspectives on those things. I tend to try to, the challenge that I face in discussing this issue theologically in terms of theological positions is that I think it has the temptation to draw us away from what really matters, in the sense that if, for instance, I need to convince somebody who has a dispensational theology that they should have a covenant theology in order to really get to the conversation, then I think that it can derail what's most important.
Mm.
So for me, the main question is, regardless of what theological position you hold within kind of the larger umbrella of Christian orthodoxy, um, what is most important? And that goes to the sense of what you were talking about. My faith informs my belief about God's call to justice, God's call to humility, to mercy, the church's prophetic role to stand alongside the powerless, to demonstrate love to the brokenhearted. Uh, so I think it's dangerous to interpret events theologically and historically. That I think has done more harm and been used to justify unjustifiable action often more than it's been helpful. So when I talk about this theologically, I tend to sidestep the question and say, regardless of what you think God wants to do with the Old Testament promises to the people of Israel, if God wants to do it, God will do it. My role is not to make it happen. My goal is not to kind of come alongside and say, I think God wants this, so I'm going to support injustice in order to accomplish God's plan. God's perfectly capable of accomplishing his plan for the world without me. What he's called me to is to stand up and, like the prophets in the Old Testament, call out against injustice, to keep people accountable who say that they're
Mm-hmm.
following God but not living that way, to do that. So, I think that's kind of how I approach it theologically. And I try to give a little bit of context to, well, again, the history, because you know a point that I often make is that some Muslims interpret the rise of Islam from the small Bedouin tribe to the most powerful empire in the world as proof. This is God's hand. This is God's blessing. How else could this happen if it weren't for God? I mean, this is a small Bedouin tribe in Saudi Arabia that within a few hundred years has conquered the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And so the interpretive frame that many Muslims use is, this is proof
Mm-hmm.
behind this. And so I think we got to be very careful. And honestly, that if you're going to do that, they've got a pretty good case. If you're just going to look at history and try to find God's hand. So I'm very, very hesitant to impose theological interpretations on what I consider very human events
Mm-hmm.
in that sense.
So like the bringing the Bible to this conflict and like looking at the pages of scripture to try to find parallels to what's going on in, you know, in the headlines. That's what you're saying, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And that's
Yeah.
when you study kind of the rise of more extremist Islamic movements,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of times their narrative is we got to go back to Islam and its original pure form when God blessed it and when God was clearly behind us. And that's what they use to draw people into the extremist ideology they have. So I think I'm just very, very hesitant to do that with political events. Now, I have a lot of different thoughts about the politics, more observations and explanations and solutions, but I do think history can help us understand different narratives that drive political events, to interpret and analyze what's going on. But that's certainly a broader conversation.
Yeah. I'll also just toss in there. I know I didn't really answer the political dimension of this question, but one of the lenses that I have found to be really helpful, and I know conservatives kind of like bristle when I say it, is I really find settler colonial theory to be a helpful kind of lens or framework. It's a tool. It doesn't explain everything that's going on, but when you think particularly about Israel and Palestine in the last 100 odd years, and the transfer of one people away from land and of another people toward that land, in all different kinds of phases and methods and contexts, but basically, you know, when you take these two people and this land, one people is progressively over 100 years being dispossessed of it, and another is taking possession of it. And even when I hear about things like what's in the news right now, the Likud party hosting an event at the border of Gaza that's called "Getting Ready to Settle Gaza" or like preparing for the settlement of Gaza party, and Likud is the ruling party in Israel. Um, there's resources in settler colonial theory for unpacking, you know, and explaining events like that. So,
Yeah.
Anyway, there'd be more to talk about related to
Yes,
that.
there's a ton to talk about. Well, why don't we go ahead and move on?
Yeah.
To the next question.
Yeah. So this one's for you too, Bill. Netanyahu recently framed the war as Hezbollah's fault. What do you think about that comment? Do you think Hezbollah is responsible for what's happening in Lebanon, and if so, to what degree?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer this because it's two separate questions. The first is about Netanyahu's claim, and the second is about Hezbollah's responsibility in Lebanon. So, I mean, in the clearest terms, I think what Netanyahu says is a blatant misrepresentation. And so if you just go really short history of Hezbollah, I don't want to draw it out. But during the Lebanese Civil War, which happened between 75 and 90, Israel occupied southern Lebanon. And the origins of Hezbollah, as we know it today, are as a resistance movement to this Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon. And then after the civil war ended, the different militias in Lebanon all disarmed, with the exception of Hezbollah. And Hezbollah did not disarm because Israel continued to occupy the south. So in some sense, the Israeli occupation during and post-civil war in Lebanon created or helped to create the power imbalance that currently exists in Lebanon. And even when Israel withdrew in 2000, it didn't surrender all of the Lebanese territory, which created an ongoing pretext for Hezbollah to stay armed. And then we have Israel's war with Lebanon or with Hezbollah in 2006, which ended up strengthening Hezbollah's position. And then there's a lot more historical events that go on politically since then. But framing the war as Hezbollah's fault, I think is just simply inaccurate. Now, I think the second question is a different question. So, is Hezbollah responsible for what's happening in Lebanon? And I think I'd answer that question by saying not completely, but certainly partially. And this is a bigger question. The political class in Lebanon is mostly responsible for what's happening in the country. And that's beyond the events of the conflict with Israel. It's the economic collapse. There's a lot that goes into that. And Hezbollah, as a significant political and power player in Lebanon, has some culpability in that. And the level of culpability is going to be based on your perspective of political events. So it's when I hear people say they want to support Lebanon, my question is who in Lebanon exactly? Because the political class in Lebanon has not proven trustworthy. So who is there to support, and who is there to blame? I think the political class as a whole carries a lot of the blame, and even Lebanese people to some extent who continue to re-elect that political class carry some blame. And so in recent years, there's a growing civil society movement. It's still in its early stages. So I'd say Hezbollah contributes to the problems in Lebanon, but Netanyahu's claim that the war is Hezbollah's fault, or even that the war is with Hezbollah and not Lebanon, is both an illegitimate justification as well as an oversimplification that's really crafted for Western media.
Mm-hmm.
For me, living in the region, I think one of the most frustrating experiences I had was regularly hearing the persona of victim that some Israeli leaders have applied to the state of Israel to justify certain destruction and aggression. And now it's not every Israeli leader. It's not every Israeli for certain, but it definitely applies to Netanyahu. And when you live through and see the discrepancy in destruction, I can remember, and this is not to make light of anything, but I can remember, I think it was in the 2006 war when thousands were dead in Lebanon. And then I read a report about, people in northern Israel suffering from anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And there was just this disconnect between two, real experiences, but as if they were equivalent in substance, in value.
That surfaces, I think, a larger issue about the difference between reality on the ground and the perception of it from overseas, which just comes up across all different kinds of aspects of this conflict. When death, like if you look at casualty counts, on either side of virtually any war historically that Israel has been a part of. If you look at, the physical destruction on different sides in virtually any recent war, if you look at territory won and lost, across any of these indicators, Israel comes out the winner. Virtually every time. There are ways that Westerners think about that, though, that reverse the narrative. That do cast Israel as a victim, or as weak, as like the David and Goliath kind of formula. And yeah, like you said, the disconnect between the perception and the reality on the ground is kind of astounding.
Yeah, I remember when, because part of my study was just really understanding and diving deeply into cultural aspects of of the region. And I do think that Israel does an excellent job of knowing how to communicate to the West.
Mhm.
They're very good at it. And one thing I talk about in my seminar is, emotion, expressions of emotion, and a lot of words indicate concern in large parts of the Arab context. And so this from the Western perspective, this overdoing of emotion.
Mm.
So I can remember watching like CNN interviews, and the spokesman for Israel being very calm and
Mm.
very, selective in its words, and then the Palestinian Saab Etiquette just speaking over an emotion and cutting
Yeah.
off and saying things. And I just wanted to say, yeah, Habibi, know who you're talking to, because in the West that's seen as annoying or rude, not
Right.
that you care. And
Right.
so I think and then that kind of goes to this next question that I'll ask you is, how do you think the Western media has covered the war?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the coverage has been poor. It's been insufficient. It's been, at the worst of times, misleading. Um, and that's not like left. It makes very little difference um, where you would put the media outlet on a kind of ideological spectrum until you get to the extremes. You do have an extreme um, left wing and extreme right wing voices that speak kind of differently. But then there's this huge swath in the middle that encompasses most people in the readers would be represented across most readers would be represented across that large part of the spectrum, where it largely sounds the same. Left wing, right wing, middle media tend to uh, frame the conflict in ways that Israel, accepting kind of Israeli talking points. Uh, you know, the story started on October 7th. Um, uh, we get to hear the life stories of Israeli casualties or hostages. We do not hear the life stories of Palestinian casualties. Um, or Palestinians who now have been running for their lives in Gaza for the last 100 years or of the last year. I'm sure it feels like 100 years. um,
Yeah, I can remember when I was in Lebanon during US's war in Iraq, and I was working out, and I used to put in my workout, I would put Al Jazeera, which is a very extreme, I would say, position in the Arab world, and Fox News. And I would watch both of those while I'm working out. And it was like
oh my
watching
gosh,
two
did your brain explode?
completely, yeah, two completely different things, because of the way they were representing. Yeah. And, Al Jazeera is showing people dying and blood and crying, and Fox News was embedded with the U.S. troops and saying, "Hey, I just want to say hi to my wife back home." It was just such this interesting, like, what's going on here? But I do
Yeah,
think, and I'm going to jump ahead because one of the questions was, what then? Where can we get sources
mm.
that's more reliable or accurate
Yep.
about what's happening? Um, so, I mean, I have some thoughts on that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts because I think it pairs well off this discussion.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have a list of sources that I fully trust to account for telling the whole story.
Mhm.
I have a more sort of composite approach. Um, I listen to Al Jazeera, I check in with Fox News, and I look for sources in between those as well. And over the composite picture, um, uh, themes, patterns, knowledge emerges. If I were to recommend any one particular source, I guess I wouldn't really want to do that, but if I had to, the one that I probably would point people to is a magazine called 972, which is a joint media project by Palestinian and Israeli journalists. They work together to tell the stories of concern related to Israel and Palestine, to the occupation, to the settlement projects, to Israeli politics and that sort of thing. I like that it's Palestinians and Israelis working together to tell those stories, and I find the way that they report those to be pretty rigorous as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm similar. Like I don't like to say, well, you should go here, because I think without background, it's really hard to navigate any of the news, whether it's Al Jazeera or Fox or everywhere in between. I think for me, because I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the background, then I can sort of parse through these things a little bit. So the question that goes back, I think, to the person who asked it is, how much time and energy are you interested in spending in knowing context? And once you have that, then you can really look at a variety of sources and take the composite approach you're talking about. I mean, I go to Naharnet, which is a local Lebanese media source, they have an English website that just gives you the news of what's kind of happening. So I just read headlines. The Orient does a pretty good job of providing English insights. I follow Michael Young, who is on X and has a lot of knowledge and experience in the region, or Claudia Tanios from Reuters. But
yep. I also like Peter Beinart is a Jewish American journalist who's very thoughtful on these topics. And the other thing I'll mention too is Ad Fontes Media, which is a nonprofit organization in the U.S. They actually do checks on both on a bias axis, ideological bias axis, and on a factuality, reliability axis. And they've done those kinds of checks on hundreds of media outlets. You can go to their website, Ad Fontes Media, and I find it really helpful to just say, okay, I'm gonna look for things that are rigorous. I'm not really interested in reading things that are, marginal towards fake news. That's a waste of time. But as long as it's rigorous and reliable, then among that subset, I want to be looking at things that lean left, lean right, and down the middle.
And do you have any thoughts on Christian media in particular?
Yeah, I would say that Christian media has been just as the problems that beset media in general beset Christian media just as much on this topic, maybe even more so in some ways because of the role of Christian Zionism. And so, Christianity Today, its flagship evangelical magazine, has published a whole range of articles, and they produced a podcast as well, a limited series podcast. There have been some of the articles written by correspondents. Their reporters from the Middle East have been good. A lot of the stuff that their US-based editorial team has produced, I find to be extremely problematic, because in my view, it's repeating these talking points that are really disconnected from reality. And yeah, so CT, I can't recommend for reading on this topic. I would say Christian Century magazine is making some new efforts towards re-anchoring their editorial position, re-anchoring it to reality on the ground. Even just in the last 6 months to a year, I've been seeing that. And full disclosure, I've written some for them as well. What else? Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, I do know. I mean, I know personally that certain voices from the evangelical Arab perspective have not been able to be represented
Right.
uh, in Christianity today, unfortunately.
Yeah.
A friend of mine, Dr. Martin Odd, who is very well known, very respected, has taught at Fuller and other places, is not allowed to provide his voice in that
Right. Yeah.
space. So,
Yeah, that's a problem.
mhm.
What's next? What do we have?
Yeah, switching a little bit. There's a question about how you think the student protests have shaped the national discussion about the conflict. And so this is a little bit more US focused.
Right.
And I don't have much insight into this, so I'd appreciate your perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. So the student protests were, that was a loud and big story last year. I would say it's been a smaller story this fall. There was a lot of wondering, like, oh, will these protests get loud again? Will the encampments start again as students are coming back from summer break? And it just hasn't been as much on the radar. I'm not quite clear on if that's big. I mean, my suspicion is because it is a smaller thing, especially in the ramp up to the election. A lot of political energy and attention is going towards the election that might otherwise be still going towards what's happening in Gaza. The reporting last spring, last fall and spring with the protests, I would say was a real mixed bag. And it's because the protests, if all of the activities that have fallen under that category um, can be referred to as the protests, then the protests were very diverse set of events and activities from people coming to those activities with very different motives. And so I would caution against thinking about the protests in too broad of a brush. And part of this is personal for me too, because I've participated in some. And I would never want to participate in a protest that is in reality anti-Semitic. And there were those kinds of protests out there. Or, sometimes people will come to a protest who are themselves anti-Semitic and might be carrying anti-Semitic signs or whatever. And yet that should not be allowed to stand as representing the full meaning and motivation of others who are participating in those. I've been to several protests in Chicago. I live near Chicago. Over the course of the last year, run by various Muslim groups and Palestinian advocacy groups, primarily calling for a ceasefire, calling for humanitarian aid, calling for an end of the occupation, calling for an end of apartheid. Those kinds of things that, if they were understood, a lot of people could get behind them. I've also been involved in collective actions that were faith-based in nature. In fact, I planned an interfaith pilgrimage ceasefire pilgrimage last year, we had about 250 or 300 people from around Chicagoland show up, and they included Christians, Jews, and Muslims came to that pilgrimage, and we had a prayerful, reflective pilgrimage. We walked to different stations along the park and paused and prayed together for life to be valued, for ceasefire, for the things that I was just mentioning. And it was very cool to see how various folks who were participating responded. One of the kind of core leaders of the Muslim protests in Chicago, she's been involved all year long in the big ones that draw thousands of people. She came just as a participant to that one and said she'd never seen anything like it and was really blessed. Does that fall into the protests? Because that kind of an event is very different from others, which are different from still others. So
yeah. Well, thanks. That's really helpful context.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a couple really quick political questions, and then I know with time you're probably coming up against when you need to stop. So
Yep.
Let me know. There is a question about how involved we think Iran would get, or whether U.S. will end up firing missiles and sending troops. And I think
wish they would fire muscles.
Yeah, fire missiles would be nice. I'd be happy to receive some of those. And so I just wanted to kind of quickly comment. There was a political comment, someone making political commentary on one of the Arabic stations, and basically he said, in some senses, what's happened is you have a chessboard, and what we've done, what Israel's actions have done, has just thrown all the pieces into the air and hoped that they land well, that there's a real uncertainty to how the events will unfold. And so when I see a question like that, I feel like the pieces are all still very much hanging in the air. And I don't know that I have insight to know how they're going to fall. There are so many different potential ways for this to fall out. So that's kind of where I land in questions, predictive questions like that.
Yeah, that question asks us to predict what's going to happen, and there's so much about what's going on that makes it very difficult to predict, and so much going on behind the scenes, that we don't have access to. The kinds of conversations that are happening diplomatically between countries, internally within a country, between political class and military class. There's a lot of X factors, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
Bill, then there's a question here too about the two-state solution. Is there any hope for a two-state solution?
Mm-hmm.
And I think I might reframe this and take the "is there any hope for" part out, because what I just want to kind of explain is there are various proposals that have been brought forward by different groups, and each of them, there's no one two-state solution. There are many two-state solution proposals. There are many one-state solution proposals. And I guess the one thing I'd like to stress is that there are Israelis who support one-state solutions. There are Israelis who support two-state solutions. There are Palestinians who support one-state solutions and two-state solutions. It's not like one option is the pro-Israeli option and one is the pro-Palestinian option.
Yeah.
I think that might be an assumption that some people make sometimes. or not really understanding what a one-state solution is. I feel like sometimes folks with a more sympathy for the Israelis might hear a one-state solution and somehow get it confused in their minds with what they've heard that between the river and the sea means, and they think of it as a genocidal call for a one Palestinian state with no Israel. And those aren't safe assumptions to make either. I think when you hear terminology like that being discussed, it's better to ask, what do you mean by that? Or can you expand on what you mean by one state or two state? What particular proposal are you talking about? Because the devil's in the details when it comes to those.
Yeah. So what do you think? I mean, I know through my time in the region, there were different moments with different leaders. So even back many years ago when Yitzhak Rabin, before he was assassinated, he had a position where he had legitimacy and yet was pushing for a peace. There was a time when Ariel Sharon, who was responsible for overseeing Sabra and Shatila in Lebanon, seemed like he had enough and was moving more towards trying to find a solution, and then had a stroke. And so how much of potential way forwards would you say is rooted in who the leaders are that are negotiating these things?
I think it's part of it, but leaders are responding to their political moment as well.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of it has to do with the political moment. Netanyahu is he's not helpful, I would say, but his political moment is making it easy for him to not be helpful.
Mm-hmm.
His coalition it's a broad coalition that includes a lot of extremist sentiments and beliefs and goals. So he's a smart politician. He's going to give what he needs to give in order to stay in power. And right now, because of who's in his coalition, he needs to have parties on the border of Gaza, that where they talk about settling Gaza, those kinds of things. So I think leaders, they have factors that they have to navigate, and at some point it becomes a question of, will this leader be a self-sacrificial leader in pursuit of peace,
right,
or will they not?
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of folks involved right now who are not being self-sacrificial in pursuit of peace. They're pursuing their personal political gain over long-term peace.
Yeah, I think you do see that. It's when people are willing to risk losing power that opportunities for moving forward in peace are possible. But when people are operating out of fear of loss of power is when I think a lot of those opportunities seem to not be possible.
Yep.
Okay, well, with your time, I don't know if you wanted to answer the question about Zionism.
This is a huge question, and I don't have any time, but let me try to take it quickly.
Okay. So the question is, how would you define Zionism?
Yeah, and the way I think about it is Zionism is support for the modern state of Israel as a uniquely Jewish state. So if you take the uniquely Jewish part out, it's not Zionism anymore. It's patriotism for, or support, if you're not an Israeli, support for another state, in the way that I might say, I support Ukraine, or whatever. What makes it Zionism is that this state is uniquely for a particular ethnic group. And then, from where I stand as an American Christian, the world that I swim in is awash in a very similar, or related phenomenon called Christian Zionism, which is Zionism. It's support for the modern state of Israel as a uniquely Jewish state that is rooted in that. If I were a Christian Zionist, I root that position in the Bible. I draw on Christian theology and scripture to support and undergird that political position. You can recognize, like, some of the hallmarks of Christian Zionism are that you might believe that there are two peoples of God. This could get kind of theological position that God is working on one track with the Jewish people, and that he has a kind of redemptive project that involves them. And then there's this separate track that involves the church. And so there are like these two parallel theological, God's got two parallel projects that sort of touch sometimes, but essentially they're distinct. That's a pretty Christian Zionist way of thinking. And then the belief that the modern state of Israel is continuous with the Old Testament kingdom of Israel as well isn't necessarily definitive of Christian Zionism, but it's common among Christian Zionists. So there you go. How's that for a really quick?
It works for me.
Okay.
Yeah, well done. Well, I do want to thank you for taking the time, Ben. I think it's been a good conversation. I hope it's not the end of the conversation at Wheaton College or even with us, but that it's leading into further conversations. There's a lot, I think, that we have to talk about, and a lot that we have to think about, and ways that we have to be in. Our faith has to inform our action.
Indeed. Thanks, Bill. Really appreciate the chance to be in conversation with you, and let's do more of it.
All right. Sounds great.